When we think of the Australian Labor Party, we often think of a political force that champions the underdog, standing up for workers, refugees, and the vulnerable. But when it comes to immigration policy, the reality is more complicated. For over 30 years, Labor has often played on fears and emotions to win votes. Despite their progressive reputation, they've implemented and supported policies that are far from welcoming. And even worse, they've made it increasingly difficult and expensive for everyday Australians to reunite with their families. It all started in 1992. The Labor government under Prime Minister Paul Keating introduced mandatory detention for asylum seekers. Anyone arriving by boat was detained indefinitely. Keating's government claimed it was to deter queue jumpers, but this policy relied on fear that asylum seekers were overwhelming our borders. This was the foundation for much harsher policies to come. Fast forward to 2001, the Tampa affair. Hundreds of asylum seekers were stranded on a Norwegian freighter, and the Howard government refused to let them land in Australia. You might remember this as a dark moment in our history. But what's often forgotten is that the Labor Party, under leader Kim Beazley, fully supported the government's stance. They backed the Pacific Solution, where asylum seekers were sent to offshore detention camps in Nauru and Papua New Guinea. This wasn't compassion. It was about playing to nationalistic fears that Australia was being invaded. In 2007, Labor returned to power under Kevin Rudd, promising a kinder, more humane approach to asylum seekers. But by 2012, under Julia Gillard, Labor reinstated offshore processing, sending asylum seekers to remote detention centres. But by 2012, under Julia Gillard, Labor reinstated offshore processing, sending asylum seekers to remote detention centres. This time, they argued it was to stop deaths at sea. But make no mistake, this was still fear-mongering, wrapped in concern for safety. It wasn't just about saving lives. It was about making sure no more boats would arrive on Australian shores. It wasn't about saving lives. It was about making sure no more boats would arrive on Australian shores. Then in 2013, Kevin Rudd, in an election year, made a dramatic shift. He declared that any asylum seeker arriving by boat would never be settled in Australia. His government expanded offshore detention even further. Labor, a party that was once seen as a friend of refugees, was now using the same language of fear, we must secure our borders, to convince voters they could be trusted to protect the nation. Even in more recent times, under leaders like Bill Shorten and Anthony Albanese, Labor has refused to push for a significant increase in our refugee intake. In 2016, while the world faced a global refugee crisis, Labor kept Australia's humanitarian refugee intake low. Why? Labor feared backlash from voters concerned about immigrants taking jobs or straining public services. Once again, Labor leaned into the fear-based narrative that immigrants were a threat to the nation's economic security. If you do not believe me, why are we rejecting the visas of Palestinian civilians fleeing Gaza? But Labor's policies aren't just affecting asylum seekers. They're also making it harder for Australians to reunite with their families. Family visas have become more expensive and harder to secure. Under Labor, the costs for sponsoring a family member to migrate to Australia have soared. For a partner visa, the costs can now exceed $8,000 in fees, not including legal expenses and other paperwork costs. This has placed an immense financial burden on Australian families who simply want to be together. And it's not just the cost. Processing times have stretched out, with some families waiting years for their applications to be processed. This isn't just bureaucratic delay, it's a policy decision. Labor has been slow to reform these systems, even as the human toll mounts. Many families are forced to live apart or take on significant debt just to navigate the complex and expensive process of migration. Truth is, for over 30 years, Labor has used fear and emotion to shape its immigration policies, whether it's about securing borders or protecting jobs. And now, they're making it harder and more expensive for Australians to reunite with their families. It's not about compassion, it's about votes. As voters, we need to ask ourselves, are we being manipulated by fear? Or is there a better way forward? A way that reflects the true values of fairness and justice?